Hello and welcome to this video on the dissemination of weather information.
And as you know, pilots need weather information, and before every flight, you should get a complete weather briefing before you go fly to make sure you know what kind of weather to anticipate. Of course, this is required for a safe flight. You want to make sure that you avoid hazardous weather, and also this would make sure getting a weather briefing and a complete weather information will assure you that you're in compliance with the federal regulations, specifically 91-104, that says that you need to get weather information for IFR flights and also flights not in the vicinity of the airport. So what we're going to do now is look at your sources of weather information, specifically weather briefings. So flight service stations, of course, are a primary source for weather briefings. They have people that are specially trained to provide briefings. They're called flight service specialists. And these people have to go to Oklahoma City, get training down there, at least the federal ones do, and the ones that are employed by the FAA. And eventually they do get certified, and also they are qualified as pilot weather briefers. The ones at Leidos also have to be certified and qualified. I'm not sure of the method, but I'm more certain that they do that in-house at their own facilities. So flight service stations provide a whole bunch of different services. As the name implies, it's a flight service station. And what they do is, of course, they provide weather briefings for pilots, but more so, just besides pilot briefings, they also help with pre-flight plan processing. In other words, they'll take your flight plans, whether they be IFR or VFR, and they'll file them for you. They also provide weather information while you're airborne in flight. You can get that over the radio. Also, they help with, or at least they initiate, search and rescue efforts if you end up delayed on your flight or lost, or for that matter, if you crash. They also handle aircraft emergencies, especially en route. If you get lost, they can help with some services. And they also are in the business of handling notices to airmen, or NOTAMs. There are two very general types of flight service stations, ones that provide weather briefings in person and ones that do not provide weather briefings in person. In Alaska, there are 17 flight service stations across the state, and these are operated by the U.S. government, and they provide in-person briefings as well as other services. You can go to the airport, walk right into the flight service station, and see the briefer and talk to them. In the lower 48 contiguous United States, a weather briefing can be obtained from a flight service station that's operated by Leidos. Leidos is a private company that has a contract with the FAA, and Leidos came out of the divestiture of Lockheed Martin. It's a spin-off company. And they have call centers across the United States where you can call and get a weather briefing.
There are currently two flight service stations in the United States. Those are in Washington, D.C. and also Fort Worth, Texas. They'll handle all of the telephone briefings that pilots make to flight service stations. Depending upon where you are and the load at that particular flight service station, you may either get Fort Worth or Washington, D.C. As you can imagine, with the internet and other types of applications, such as ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot, flight service stations are not doing as many telephone briefings as they once did. There were 3 flight service stations up until the fall of 2019. Prescott, Arizona was closed, and now we're down to only 2 flight service stations.
Now we'll talk about the types of weather briefings that you can get from a flight service station. The first one we'll start with is telephone briefings. So telephone briefings, or your weather briefings, can be classified as either standard, abbreviated, or Outlook briefings. A standard briefing is asked, or you request it, whenever you haven't received any previous weather information, or you have not received a previous weather briefing. And there is a standard sequence for a standard briefing. Starts out giving you the adverse conditions, and then based upon their judgment, they decide whether a VFR is recommended or not. They go through a synopsis of weather features such as highs, lows, and fronts. They go through the current conditions, meaning METARs. After that, they go through a route forecast for your route, and then finally your destination forecast. Also, they provide the winds aloft and notices to airmen, and then any other air traffic control delays. The abbreviated briefing is a little bit different than the standard briefing. An abbreviated briefing is requested when there is a need to supplement additional information. If you have some information already, if you had a weather briefing and you just need a few items, or if you are curious about weather hazard, you want an update on that, then you'll ask for an abbreviated briefing. And when you ask for an abbreviated briefing, you probably should give the pilot briefer the background, a little bit of information about when you got your information and where you got it from, and what kind of information you received. And then you should request specific items. I'd like the TAF for Minneapolis or something like that. And the briefer will try and follow a standard briefing format as much as possible. And they will advise you of present and forecast adverse weather conditions. Finally, the outlook briefing should be requested when your estimated time of departure is more than 6 hours from the briefing time. So if you're planning on taking a flight into the future. And the briefer will at least provide as much information as they can as is available to them at that time. Remember that the outlook briefing is only for planning purposes only. In other words, it's supposed to give you an idea of what's going to happen in the future. So before you go fly, you should probably get a little bit more supplemental information. In other words, get a good detailed briefing, whether that be a standard briefing or an abbreviated briefing before you go. Next, we'll talk about in-flight weather briefings. And of course, an in-flight briefing is one that you get over the VHF radio from the airplane as you fly. So you would contact flight service stations over the radio. For example, you would say Grand Forks Radio. This is 201 Mike Charlie, and I'd like a briefing, weather briefing. They can provide you all sorts of weather information while you're flying along. You could be specific and say I need a standard briefing. Typically, they don't like to do standard briefings over the radio, but they do abbreviated. They'll help provide information as needed. And also, you can probably even ask for an outlook if you're doing one leg of the flight and planning on returning sometime later. They can give you a little bit of an update. So just ask them for the information and they'll provide it as they can. The next type of weather briefing we'll talk about is self-briefings. A self-briefing is one in which a pilot obtains weather information on their own. And the FAA was concerned about how pilots get weather information and the type of weather information they obtain. So they put out an advisory circular 91-92, which is the pilot's guide to a pre-flight briefing. And basically, that gives you a roadmap as far as how to get weather information, how to interpret weather information, and then also operational risk management. In other words, how to avoid hazards. There is so much weather information and so many different ways to get weather information that the FAA wanted to clarify exactly what a self-briefing is. And a self-briefing, they say, uses all, of course, your available resources, including automation, and going through and evaluating the weather information and aeronautical information before your flight. Since self-briefings are not really structured, the FAA wanted to provide some framework for pilots to obtain weather information. So Advisory Circular 91-92 provides a sample pre-flight checklist that goes through all of the FAA resources and also information that you can use before your flight to provide weather information. And you should use an FAA approved source for your pre-flight weather briefing. Typically you use a service that's contracted through the FAA that taps into the National Weather Service weather network or data network, and also provides additional information for flight planning such as NOTAMs and other things. So you can use this for pre-flight planning, and the FAA has contracted Leidos to provide a web portal for pre-flight briefing and also flight planning. And that's your 1-800-WX-BRIEF.com. This is a great site. Of course, you need to have an account typically provided by medical. If you have your medical, then you can go ahead and sign up. The account is free, and they provide so much information out here. Not only can you can get or file flight plans, whether they be VFR and IFR, but also they provide weather information. They'll do en route, of course, en route flight. They'll do local area flights. They can provide weather information for that. This weather portal is just phenomenal. And you can specify, you can set it up to look at graphics that you look at all the time, that you can kind of customize the page if you like. But it is a great source of information. There are other sources of information that pilots can use to provide self-briefing besides just the Leidos website. Of course, many pilots use ForeFlight. Also, Garmin Pilot provides weather information, as well as other websites such as AOPA, WSI, and many, many others. So it's left up to the pilot to decide what type of briefing they want and also what type of information. But the FAA, through the Advisory Circular 92-91, provides a framework for that. And with that, we'll conclude our discussion of weather briefings and sources of weather information.